If one was to think of the main heroes from the War of the Ring, it's likely they would say Frodo, Aragorn, Theoden, Éomer, the other members of the Fellowship, but oft forgotten is the one man that bore the brunt of the fighting, not just from the war itself, but in the decades leading up to it. And this fighting took a massive toll on him, both mentally and physically. They oft forget the man that was able to stand up to Sauron for so long, on a personal level, only crumbling at the very end when all seemed lost. In this video, I'll be talking about Denethor, the forgotten and perhaps misunderstood hero. In the last few decades, cynicism has been all the rage in fantasy settings. Complex, morally grey characters are popular. Characters that are paragons of virtue or are just evil for the sake of being evil have been pushed to the wayside. It's often been a criticism that has been levelled at the Lord of the Rings. Most of the good guys are pretty much perfect in a way that almost doesn't exist in our own history. Likewise, the bad guys' motivations are fairly simple. They just want to conquer everything. This isn't to say Tolkien couldn't write morally grey characters. I mean, the Silmarillion is full of them. But in the Lord of the Rings, it's fairly black and white. The exception is Denethor. I know some people might consider Boromir morally grey, but apart from one moment of weakness, thanks to the ring's corruption, he's a pretty upstanding guy. And even Denethor himself isn't really a morally grey character in a modern sense. He's wise, valiant, and completely opposed to evil. But Denethor has some massive flaws, and thanks to the fact that he's surrounded by characters who are almost perfect, these flaws stand out and result in us being very critical of Denethor. Before I talk about Denethor's forgotten successes, I do want to talk about these flaws. Denethor doesn't exactly come across as a nice guy. His demeanor is grim, and he isn't afraid of showing contempt towards those he dislikes. For example, Gandalf and Faramir. His behavior towards Faramir is especially bad, blatantly showing favoritism for the older brother Boromir, and going as far as to say that he wished their places had been exchanged, possibly implying that he wished Faramir had died instead. Denethor's demeanor meant that while he was respected, he was never truly loved by his own people. Denethor also displays several other negative character traits, an overabundance of pride, jealousy, and paranoia. Denethor's pride and overestimation of his own abilities is arguably what leads to his own downfall, which begins with the use of the Palantir, which brings him into contact with Sauron. Over time, this led to Denethor's mental disintegration, and even prematurely aged him. The knowledge Denethor gleaned from the Palantir also caused him to overly rely on his own advice. While he was willing to listen to others, it was generally his way or the highway, and he wasn't afraid to disregard the advice of those who he didn't look upon fondly or did not completely trust. The jealousy and paranoia go hand in hand, and it stems from Denethor's youth. When Thorongil served in Gondor, Denethor enviously watched him earn the love and affection of Gondor's citizens, something Denethor had been unable to do. He also correctly guessed Thorongil's true identity, Aragorn. This made him paranoid that Aragorn would one day, in his own words, usurp his position, and he believed that Gandalf was the true force behind this. Thus, he was greatly suspicious of Gandalf his entire life, and had a negative view of those who associated with him, such as Faramir. And of course, it doesn't help that we the audience see Denethor at his very worst. When we first meet him, Denethor is already in despair at the loss of Boromir. He's under a great deal of pressure because Sauron's invasion is clearly imminent, and when we view him through Pippin's eyes, Denethor is dealing with Gandalf, a person whom he dislikes. We also, in great detail, get to see him break and attempt to kill both himself and a wounded Faramir. He only succeeds in killing himself, and it's quite a gruesome death. He literally stands there and lets the fire consume him. However, I think that nothing influences people more in their opinion about Denethor than the Peter Jackson films. As much as I like the films, I think the handling of Denethor was awful. Jackson takes Denethor and makes him 10 times worse. He doesn't just come across as a bad person, he also comes across as entirely irrational and incompetent. Two examples are that he doesn't ignite the beacons to call upon Rohan. Instead, this is done by Gandalf and Pippin, and then we have Denethor order a suicidal counterattack against Osgiliath, willingly sacrificing his own son. Neither of these scenes happen in the books. This was a conscious choice by Jackson to make the viewer dislike Denethor intensely. We're supposed to hate him during Pippin's song. Contrasted against Pippin's voice, we get a guy furiously munching on cherry tomatoes. We're supposed to laugh when Gandalf knocks him out, and we're supposed to laugh again when he, whilst fully engulfed in flames, throws himself off the top of Minas Tirith. Also, just saying, that's like a several 100-meter run. I don't know how he actually managed to do that. Perhaps his only redeeming moment is his final words when he sees that Faramir is still alive. Yet, when people mention what Jackson did wrong, they might mention elves at Helm's Deep, and as far as characters go, they might mention Faramir. But the difference with Faramir and Denethor is that Faramir got to where he was supposed to be character-wise. There was a detour to Osgiliath, with a logical explanation at least. Jackson needed more scenes for the Frodo and Sam journey because he didn't want to begin Return of the King with them already at Cirith Ungol, like they are in the books. Remember, Jackson wasn't planning on including the Scouring of the Shire. The fact that many people are willing to overlook Denethor's butchering, for me, it just goes to show that people don't care as much when changes happen to a character they dislike. And as I said earlier, surrounded by paragons of virtue, it's easy to dislike Denethor. But I think this is all very unfair. Although Denethor has several negative traits, it shouldn't lessen what he achieved as steward, especially when you consider the burdens that he had to carry. Consider Thorongil's service in Gondor. Although it was extremely successful, one can feel sympathy for Denethor that in the eyes of the people, he was effectively sidelined in favour of some mysterious hero before he even got a chance to become steward and prove himself. And then this mysterious hero vanishes. Considering that Denethor guessed the identity of Thorongil, you can kind of understand him being bitter about the whole situation. He gets the thankless work of ruling a failing realm, while the mysterious hero gallivants around before eventually swooping back in and saving the day. Or consider that shortly after becoming steward, Denethor had to deal with a huge personal tragedy, the death of his wife, Finduilas, at the young age of only 38. It's clear that Denethor had a lot of love for his wife, as he never remarried and became noticeably more silent and grim. It's worth noting that Boromir and Faramir were only 10 and 5 years old at this time, so Denethor was a single father. He undoubtedly would have had help raising his kids, and while both of them turned out fine, it wouldn't be a stretch to say that Denethor's relationship with his kids was severely impacted by the early death of their mother. And if personal tragedies weren't enough, then one must also remember that Denethor was wise and far-seeing, even without the use of the Palantir. It became very clear to him around this time that he would have the unenviable position of ruling Gondor when Sauron launched his final war. Even before he used the Palantir, the mental toll on Denethor must have been immense. He knew Gondor was at its weakest point, and he knew that Sauron's forces were exponentially stronger. He would have known that Gondor was in an unwinnable position, unless there was some sort of miracle like the One Ring, at least in the way he perceived it. I'll talk about that in a bit. Speaking of the Palantir, let's talk about that. While the use of the Palantir played a major role in Denethor's deterioration, one must also remember that it was extremely beneficial for Gondor. Denethor used the Palantir to get information that would be useful in Gondor's defense, whether it was Sauron's troop sizes or movements, or insights into enemy plans that Denethor was able to extract from Saruman. We see the extent of this information several times throughout the books. When someone informs Denethor of something, he states that he was already aware, such as the movements of the Fellowship, the fall of Isengard, and the fall of Caer Andros. While the Palantir didn't render Denethor omniscient, one does have to wonder how many lives he might have saved by using it. Earlier I mentioned the One Ring. One of Denethor's flaws was his desire to use it against Mordor, but once again, one must look at things from Denethor's perspective. He's wise, but he doesn't understand the true nature of the One Ring. Not many people do. In his mind, it's the miracle that can save Gondor, but even then, he claims that he still wouldn't use it until the last possible moment, clearly understanding that it's still dangerous. He's against Faramir's decision to let Frodo go, because as I said before, Gondor's in an unwinnable position, and to Denethor, Faramir has just thrown away Gondor's last possible chance, dooming it and all of its people. The reality is, Denethor did as much as he could with what was available to him. Unlike how he is portrayed in the films, Denethor wasn't incompetent. In fact, he did pretty well with limited resources. Before the war began, he started rebuilding the Ramesakor, a wall of fortifications that surrounded the Pelennor fields. And although these fortifications would last a mere day against the Morgul host, it was precious time that would allow reinforcements from Rohan and southern Gondor to arrive. He also summoned the captains of the Outlands before Sauron's attack, bolstering the garrison at Minas Tirith by 3,000 men. He ordered the beacons of Gondor to be lit well in advance, a way to warn the realm that war was imminent, and to give at-risk peoples time to escape. He evacuated Minas Tirith of most of the women and children. He also sent the Red Arrow to Rohan, which was Gondor's way of asking for aid. In perhaps another stroke of bad luck for Denethor, the Red Arrow did make it to Theoden, but its carrier, Hirgon, was killed while trying to make it back to Minas Tirith, so Denethor was never aware that the Rohirrim were coming. Even when the war began, Denethor's tactical decisions were fine. When Faramir reports to Minas Tirith, Denethor sends him back to Osgiliath with a company of soldiers to hold the passage of the river for as long as possible. There is no suicide attack. This makes sense. Why wouldn't you try to hold a fortified choke point? And when Faramir's forces are in retreat, Gandalf suggests that Denethor should send out Gondor's cavalry, but Denethor has already thought of this, and he unleashes the Gondorian cavalry at exactly the right time, which allows them to smash the Morgul vanguard to pieces. He then orders them to retreat before they overextend and put themselves in danger. Unfortunately, this decision also results in Faramir being grievously wounded. And to be fair to Denethor, he only broke when, after a lifetime of tragedy and stress, his last living family member was seemingly dying right before his eyes. Lesser men would have broken from far less, and unfortunately, it's these final moments that define Denethor in the eyes of much of the fanbase. The final moments where he snapped, went insane, abandoned his people, and attempted to kill both himself and his son. Instead of leaving a legacy of a stalwart defender, he left behind the legacy of a madman who abandoned his people in their hour of need. As unfortunate as this was for Denethor, perhaps it was what was best for Gondor. Although Denethor was the perfect man to lead Gondor into the darkness, he was not the perfect man to lead them out into the light again. He did not inspire love, he was not the man to rekindle old alliances or make peace with former enemies, and most importantly, as he said himself, he would not have stepped aside for the return of a king. In that way, a post-war Gondor with Denethor at the helm might have been a far less prosperous place, and if the people supported the king, which they probably would have, his end would have been far more ignoble. So perhaps Denethor's death was the best outcome for Gondor, even if nobody knew it at the time. But as I said earlier, this tarnished Denethor in a way that perhaps is unfair. While we don't know how exactly Denethor was treated in a post-War of the Ring Gondor, he should be treated as a hero. While grim and not exactly an inspiring or lovable man, Denethor was strong during his reign, far stronger than most. He absorbed the burden of ruling Gondor in what seemed like its final days remarkably well. He provided a steady hand and was a shield for a people who were facing their imminent destruction. He was rational and reasonable even as the walls were closing in, and some of his decisions ensured that there was a Gondor left to save when Aragorn arrived. And even if you cannot give him that, you have to concede that at the very least, he raised two brilliant sons. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I've wanted to do a video on Denethor for a long time, but I could never really formulate what I actually wanted to say about him. Instead of making an argumentative sort of essay, I decided that I wanted to at least draw attention to his good side and provide the context that would explain his bad side. Anyway, cheers, thank you, and a special thanks to my Patreons who have stuck with me in this sort of dearth of content. I really appreciate it. And remember, don't set yourself on fire, it's not worth it.